Все, транслируется. Пускай будет транслироваться. В эфире запланировать не получилось, извините. Где я написал почту? Теперь опять бежит?
Валерий Николаевич, а вы не взяли листочек-то?
Я ничего не взял. Ну, извини, пожалуйста.
Ну, что бегают, ладно. Еще где лежит?
Откуда я знаю? Где-то там, где ноутбук был. Раз, два. Звук есть. Нашел?
С Андреева.
С Андреева, да. Теперь надо эти самые. Это Яндекс, это почта. А теперь где моя-то почта? Только здесь? А, давай здесь отправим. Так.
Написать письмо.
Вот. Я что-то уже прям совсем.
А, и вставочку-то вы не сделали.
Какую ставочку?
Ну, как вставить-то?
Да сейчас я поставлю сам.
Ага.
Да. Собака.
Собака
Яндекс. Собака Яндекс. С Андреева. Собака Яндекс. Да? С Андреева. Правильно? Вроде да. Вроде да.
Ссылка на трансляцию.
Все.
Оно?
ТН, да, ТНК. Да?
Угу, ТНК, да.
Раз, два, три. Раз, два, три.
А что это такое?
Трансляция.
Уже идет, да? Ну, все. То есть, ссылочка же у вас
у меня не
есть, да?
получилось это самое запланировать. Я сразу ее открыл.
А почему не отправлен?
Ну, не отправляет он письмо, не знаю почему.
Закройте свою трансляцию.
Чего трансляция? Нажмите, чтобы включить редактор старый. А зачем он нужен?
Не знаю.
Повис, что ли? Какая
Трансляция
маленькая задержка.
идет.
Тогда я сейчас это самое.
А вы правильно здесь написали?
Подожди, я сейчас вот этот перенаправлю. Вот. МСЛО. вот этот ТНК переслать. Перенаправить. Вот эту вот мелочевку я не умею.
А нельзя это сделать?
Да вот чуть-чуть только можно и все.
Вы в очках не видите, Валерий?
Нет.
Ну давайте я буду подсказывать. Санд.
Ни хрена нет, да.
Д, Р, Е.
В галка.
Галка, да.
Ва.
Ва.
Собака.
Собака.
Яндекс.
Один, собака один.
А, еще и один.
Вот поэтому, наверное, не пошла у вас. Собака один.
Ну, не знаю.
А вот посмотрите, у вас здесь нет один, смотрите.
Нет, я знаю.
Собака один.
Нет,
Один собака, да. Яндекс.ру. Вот сюда нужно,
Попробуй.
единичку поставить.
Он у меня из этого.
Он не хочет,
Он
блин.
не хочет.
Блин.
Подожди. Я на dev.ru. Ушло.
Ну что?
Нет, это сообщение не доставлено.
Можно я здесь просто напишу его? Вот,
Пиши
набрать.
заново.
Да.
Он тоже не отправит отсюда.
Почему?
Ну вот сейчас посмотришь. Не знаю почему.
Это русский, блин. А мне нужен английский.
Я пропустил вебинар, напоминание не пришло.
Ну, что ж.
Давай я напишу, два раза дольше.
Один.
Собака.
Собака. Яндекс.
Яндекс.
Вот один,
Нет.
вот есть она, вон.
Да.
Все.
Ну,
Яндекс.ру.
ну,
Вот.
ну,
Теперь отправить.
ну. А
Письмо.
я что говорю?
А почему не идет?
Ну, потому что он не пойдет, я знаю.
Почему?
Не знаю.
Да по новой тогда надо делать.
Вебинар, напоминание еще одно пришло, начинается.
Где на вебинар?
Да я записан на вебинар. Нет,
Вы записывали?
да.
О, блин.
Написать письмо как-то. Так, написать.
Написать кому?
Ну, он не отправляет, он у меня не отправлял, это можно до утра набирать. Я тут 2С, да, С Андреева 1. Я тут 2С первый раз, поэтому не отправилась. Собака. Яндекс, да?
Да.
Не отправится.
Ну, попробуй.
Dev.ru.
Тема.
Ставить.
Тема. Как тема называлась-то?
Да никак не, ссылка, никак не
Ссылка.
Да мы вам отправить не можем уже полчаса.
Ну вот, видите, где вы, оказывается.
Да я же вам сказал, что
Давайте я вам анекдот расскажу.
он уже ехал.
А? Вот так вот.
Вот так, да.
Ой, блин.
Здравствуйте.
Хотите анекдот расскажу?
Я ему дозвонился.
Вот правильно.
Да.
Ну, в общем, скачал Чукча Зум.
Пришел?
Не слышите?
Нет, пока. Я только что посмотрела, но это не вижу.
Не хотите слышать.
Слушай, ну,
Сейчас, секунду.
Письмо отправлено,
так,
все, пошло.
всё,
И
вот.
скачал
Валерий-
Вот нажмите
Чукча.
на эту ссылку.
Не, посмотрите, оно или нет.
Это
Давайте
все
нажмите.
вот это
Валерий
про
Игнатов,
нас.
правильно?
Да, да, да.
Скачал Чукча Zoom.
Да.
Я не могу.
Говорит,
нажать.
однако звука нет.
Ой.
У меня оно никак.
Как никак?
Дофига этот Zoom без звука.
Как никак?
Ссылочку открывайте.
Он мне не открывает.
Я вас с утра жду у себя.
Меня он не открывает.
Меня?
Прямо текст письма.
Василий.
А вы скопируете ее в этот самый тогда.
Да нет, студентам пришлю просто.
Перешлите. Там НК какой-то, да, на конце? Трансляцию мы уже
НК,
запустили.
да? На конце у вас.
ARTMP youtube.com live 2. Все, может там никаких НК нету.
Значит, не то.
Мы что делать? Вот
А,
это мне
не-
пришло.
Это не то. Это не то.
Хорошо, не так.
Вот такая, это НК. Вот такая.
Такого у меня нет, переслать. Переслать. Надо
У нас
наверное.
что-то там с интернетом вообще какой-то кошмар там творится. Это вам пришло, то, что я полчаса назад отправил.
Ну, я просто его сейчас открыла и посмотрела. Я до этого там еще пыталась 150 рублей прокатывать, и поэтому... Вы же понимаете, швец и жнец, и на людей греется.
Сандреева 1.
Сандреева 1, собака Яндекс.ру.
Вот.
Да, да. Сейчас она выглядит.
Ну, сказал, что ушла. И Сергей Борисович сказал, что ушла.
Так, сейчас я-
Так вот, смотрите, я на нее
А
нажимаю.
я могу сейчас придет.
А?
Сейчас, возможно, дойдет. МСУ. Слушайте, вот пришло, да, пришло 2 раза пришло. Вот
Ну,
оно.
вот видите, теперь 2 раза.
Эффект. Вот, оно синенькое, оно должно открыться.
Вот.
Сейчас, куда?
Можете контролировать? Вот там YouTube нажать. Воспроизведение.
Ну, здравствуйте. Так, это
Нет,
что?
это не то.
Это какая-то реклама.
Вы сначала разошлите.
Я только что вот тут где-то вас видела.
Вот у меня, вот
Что это такое?
Сергей Борисович, скажи там 2 слова.
Раз. 1, 2, 3.
Я поняла, я даже себя послушаю.
Безопасно.
Так, а где же
Нет, просто сюда отправьте.
Сейчас я его ссылку оставлю.
Валерий Николаевич?
Вот,
Да.
вы есть, все. Так.
Извините, что не так быстро, потому что
Ну, ладно.
только учимся. Ну, как там мы не во всем, мы только учимся.
Выходи до начала, сейчас научимся, это будет.
Так, вот этот как мы удаляем?
Что?
Информация с сайта. Вот это.
Зачем?
Удалить.
На escape нажать здесь. Чего такое?
Вот так вот.
Вот
всё,
так
всё,
вот и всё.
всё. Ну, трансляция идет.
А?
Трансляция идет.
Трансляция идет.
Сейчас, детям просто мне их 6 штук, и надо будет это всем, чтобы...
Так мало?
6,
Групп.
нет, 6 групп.
Ага. Я побегу, ладно?
Давайте.
А то вы сейчас еще... Честно, Брониславович. Ты что камеру закрыл?
Ну, а что нас сейчас сидеть? Что нас сидеть будет?
Вы еще ни один человек Сергей Борисович, что забыть. Не, я буду хоть ты прикушать.
Значит, что, здесь трансляция идет, в принципе, все нормально.
Здесь трансляция идет, и да.
А ребят просто ходить будут и писать, брать это.
Они по ссылке в
По
пальце
ссылке,
смотрят, они
смотрят.
просто смотрят. Да, там есть чат справа. и
А
там
здесь
видно-
как-нибудь остановить трансляцию, потом запустить можно? Как?
Нет, не надо.
Не надо.
Лучше не надо.
Нет, просто они вот эти все вещи...
Нет,
которые
потом
создавали,
будет другая ссылка. Уже другую ссылку надо ссылать.
То есть останавливать нельзя.
Нельзя,
Ссылка есть,
нельзя,
всё.
не возобновляемая, да.
Так, сохранишь группу.
Вот здесь вот, Сергей Борисович, чат.
Мгм.
Каждый человек имеет вот эту возможность тут в чате что-то написать. Вот я написал, что трансляция начнется в 16:00
Всё.
по Москве.
Мгм.
Это я нажал и вот это самое, и отправил.
Мгм. Всё.
Они могут вот здесь писать, и все их сообщения здесь будут вопросы появляться.
Хорошо.
Должны.
А там это как-то сохранится потом их сообщение, да, по идее?
Ну,
Вот
по
так.
идее, по этой ссылке можно будет туда войти, трансляция есть, а чат не знаю, сохраняется.
Я просто,
или
мне
нет.
нужно потом как бы какой-то эвиденс от меня. У меня осталось, что я тут что-то делала.
Это у вас останется.
Ну, на что?
Вы можете запринтскринить, сколько тут людей, тоже можно вот
Страшные
поставить,
вещи, вот называется так что-нибудь.
Они...
сфотографировать с экрана. Вот здесь вот участники, вот сейчас пока вот один, стрим-сервис, это мы.
Ага. Я только что послала письмо студентам, ну, теперь это со мной ждем.
Теперь ждем, вот они могут здесь
Я для этого
появляться.
выслала тоже сообщение, что я тут буду, сейчас пришлю ссылку. Видишь?
Здесь участник, а здесь
Сейчас
их
узнаем.
вопрос.
Сейчас узнаем. Что люди скажут.
Ну, как везде. Вот здесь вот.
Едем сказали.
Ну, чат.
Чат.
Нажимаем сюда.
Здесь можно
Участники.
участников смотреть, сколько.
Мгм.
Да?
Нет,
Мгм.
вот так, сколько времени? Еще 4 минуты.
Ой, а где? Чё? Где я нажимал? Не помню. А, вот здесь.
Назад дальше.
Вот здесь. Вот
Ну
эти.
да, да. И
Открыть
открыть
чат
чат.
в новом окне.
Ну,
Показать или скрыть чего-то.
Мгм.
В чат не забывайте вносить свои данные и что-то такое.
Ну ладно. Ну вы нажимаете на участники, и все здесь будут участники.
Что?
видно.
Ни от кого из них, по крайней мере, не вернулась как недоставленная. Поэтому
Поэтому доставилось. Ну им же надо включиться, да?
не
Пойти
надо
по
найти.
ссылке, перейти YouTube.
Не, а там остается же в этом Ютубе.
Вот по
лекция
этой же
прошла.
самой ссылке,
Угу.
я не знаю сколько, но сколько-то времени можно ходить.
Оно там
посмотреть.
будет еще.
Да, запись,
Понял. Хорошо,
запись.
отлично.
Только по ссылке. Со стороны.
Да.
Только по ссылке. И она какое-то время хранится.
Понял.
Ну, я опоздал,
Я не-
я опоздал на
да,
лекцию.
да,
Ну,
да,
как
да,
обычно.
да, да.
Я сначала включаю и пошел
Хранится,
смотреть.
хранится.
Ну, всё.
Сергей Борисович, я вам пока оставлю, пока
Да.
не начнем.
Ну, конечно.
И пойду с вашего разрешения.
Так, и когда я заканчиваю, я просто нажимаю завершить, и все.
Сергей Борисович, уходя, оставишь свой телефон.
Ну, вот участники здесь стоят, сейчас они будут.
Я надеюсь, сейчас что-нибудь появится.
Да.
А если вы на стрелочку нажмете, то там открывается чат, где могут быть вопросы. На
Вот эта стрелочка
слева-
вот этого, да?
Слева от участника. Слева
Вот
от
это,
участника.
вот эта стрелочка, да?
Да.
Ага,
Вот видите, я там написал, трансляция начнется в 16 часов время Москвы.
поняли. Ладно. Так, время у нас
А
что?
если
Еще
сюда
3 минуты по
не,
времени, да?
на точечке,
Вот,
на
вот
точечке,
сюда,
там
вот,
участник.
вот участники нажимаем, и тогда будет.
Ага, поняла. Ну ладно, пускай стоит.
Ну, блин.
Сергей,
Нет, да, ну, немножко, да, освоиться надо.
Ну, освоимся. Что ж
Потому
делать?
что я этим делом никогда не занимался тоже. По скайпу мы говорим.
Ну, по скайпу мы
С
все
родственниками,
общаемся,
да.
естественно.
Ну,
Нет, по скайпу мы все успели уже пообщаться.
Да.
Нет, у меня народ как-то... Кто-то ухитряется создавать какие-то сессии в скайпе и что-то делать. Да, у нас коллеги на кафедре работают, но не все.
Ну, опять это надо освоить. Если нужно это, а если не нужно,
Да.
чего? Вот.
Ну да, учитывая, что мы всю жизнь общались в аудитории со студентами.
Ну, да.
И это... Нет, ну, есть более продвинутые.
Есть, да. Но это нужно посидеть, разобраться, почитать хотя бы, так сказать, все это дело. И потыкать пальчиком. И, наверное, денечек потыкать нужно. Но если ты будешь каждый день этим заниматься, то тогда
Нет, ну,
нормально.
да, есть.
А если ты раз в месяц, то забудешь.
Раз в месяц, а если раз в год?
Ну, тем более забудешь. После отпуска приходишь и думаешь, блин, куда
Ну,
ты...
кто-то лайкнул. Это вы, наверное, сами себя.
Не знаю, пока нет, честно.
Ну, ждем.
Может, это самое, камеру он
Ну, я сейчас открою. Ну, сейчас 16 часов пойдет, да, и начнем.
Время сколько? А через минуту, да?
Через минуту начнем. Это так похоже. Ой.
Поудобнее.
Сейчас.
Смотрите.
Все не так. Ну, посмотрим. Так, они видятся. Ну, если я вот здесь просто бумажку буду держать, да, то, в принципе, она не будет мешать камере.
Нет, не будет.
Ладно. Угу. Главное, мне камеру не закрыть. О, пошли.
Ну, пошли, да, да. Получили
Пошли,
ссылки, видно,
да,
пошли.
индивидуально пошли.
Если не включают, они нас слышат.
Мгм. Отлично.
Что есть в интернете тоже эти
Разные
самые
группы. Да.
прямые трансляции, вот так же они входят.
Ну, я поняла, да.
Проходит там минут 10-15 после лекции, и все, и конец.
Мгм. Ну, пошли. Пишут студенты. читают. Right. Okay. Dear students, I'm afraid I will have to start. Right. I can see 4 people at the moment who are looking at it, and I was told that apparently after the lecture is finished, you would still be able to have a look at the recorded lecture following the same link. I was also told that apparently somehow you can leave comments. And I would say, first of all, I would like to know from you if you can hear me appropriately and if I'm too fast for you. So if you would like me to slow down or repeat certain things, I think there must be an option for you to leave some kind of commentary in the chat. Another option is for you to write to my email address after the lecture with the questions which were not quite clear for you, or if you missed some formulas, although I don't think it should be too difficult for you. Okay. Yes. Так. Да, я должна нажать.
Ну, здесь
Вот сюда?
могут писать.
Они могут писать.
Да,
Ага.
здесь.
Okay, basically there is some kind of option for the chat service, so please let me know if you are falling behind. Right, so today I'm going to talk about the functional style of scientific discourse, another important functional style, and obviously something that you should be very well familiar with because it is an important integral part of your own graduation papers. So your graduation papers are supposed to follow the linguistic conventions and extra-linguistic conventions of the functional style. But today we're going to talk about the functional style of scientific discourse. So the main function of this functional style is to provide specialists with up-to-date and relevant information. What is important is, first of all, the target audience, the specialists, and the kind of information that is given to this target audience. We talk about relevant information and up-to-date information. When we talk about up-to-date information, we do not imply that only the latest information from the sphere of academic research will be treated as up-to-date. When we talk about up-to-date information, the idea is to, first of all, provide the scientists with the most important and the most precisely let me rephrase it, with information which is reflecting in the most precise fashion the current state of affairs in the world. So, for example, if we talk about research in nuclear physics, we can talk about discoveries which were made, for example, in the 1950s and the 1960s. So theoretically, of course, they are not modern, but they are still relevant because they reflect the current state of affairs. Nothing has been discovered since, for example, or nothing drastically new has been discovered since. Maybe certain additional points were added to the overall theory, but the theory itself remains unchanged. And even though it can be 50 or 60 years old, it is still relevant and up to date. In general, scientific discourse is mostly expository, but it can contain descriptive as well as narrative passages. So we can once again say we have both descriptive and narrative passages in academic discourse. For example, if the scientists describe their experiments, so they will need to provide the target audience with information as to what was the sequence of the activities provided and what kind of materials were used, what kind of changes took place in the research material in the course of the experiment, and so on and so forth. Of course, when we talk about theoretical papers, in this case, we talk about the need to prove the information provided to the readers with the help of various logical operations. According to the subject matter, scientific discourse can be classified into two large categories. The first is humanities and social sciences. So in accordance with the subject matter, we can single out, first of all, humanities and social sciences, and this is where we belong with our linguistic research and teaching as well. And the second large category is called sciences. Sometimes it's called sciences proper, and it can be divided into two varieties. We can talk about the scientific or theoretical style, and we can talk about the technical or practical style. So scientific or theoretical style and technical or practical style. That is within sciences. Of course, as you remember, hopefully from our lecture about the functional styles in the English language, Professor Nair was talking about singling out the technical or practical style into, sort of separating it from the other functional styles and sort of dealing with it as an individual functional style, owing to the specific linguistic and exolinguistic characteristics of this sphere of human knowledge. In accordance with the addressee, we can talk about two varieties. The first is scientific discourse proper, and these are those difficult to read and understand texts. And the second variety is popular scientific discourse. Popular scientific discourse is intended for the general public. We can single out different genres within the scientific style. And again, I would say you are familiar with quite a number of those genres. For example, of course, you're familiar with textbooks, articles in academic journals, lectures, manuals, other kinds of scientific papers, and I guess you dealt with various kinds of scientific papers when you were looking for your theoretical material for your graduation papers. But we also can add here all sorts of essays, reports, reviews. Obviously, we can talk about operating instructions, well, dissertations, and other various kinds of publications within the scientific domain. Okay, now, no matter how different these papers may seem, of course, since they belong to the functional style of scientific discourse, they have certain unifying characteristics. And in general, we can say that the methodology of science, with its demand for systematic research and precise description, has certain consequences. So the methodology of science, with its demand for systematic research and precise description, has several consequences. Hello to the Liverpool supporters. Right, okay, can say your messages. Right, I will first of all enumerate the characteristic features of scientific discourse, and then I will talk about their manifestation. And after that, we'll talk about linguistic characteristics in scientific texts. So first of all, we can single out 6 important points which we need to remember when we're dealing with academic research. It works for both analysis and obviously creating your own text. So please don't forget about that. So these are, first of all, we can talk about logical coherence. The second feature is objectivity. The third is impersonal statement of facts. Number 4 is clarity. Number 5 is brevity. And number 6 is authority. So once again, the 6 characteristics is logical coherence, objectivity, impersonal statement of facts, clarity, brevity, and authority. And we're going to start with the first characteristic feature, which is the logical coherence. The first point we can single out, which confirms this presence of the logical coherence in the text, is the fact that the text is organized in clear paragraphs, which are highly cohesive entities based on logic. So the text is organized in clear paragraphs, highly cohesive entities based on logic. Most paragraphs begin with the general thematic point, and the following sentences elaborate this general thematic point. Probably you spoke about this general thematic point as the topic sentence of the paragraph. This structure allows the readers to very quickly see the logical arrangement of the text. If the text is properly written, simply by looking at the first paragraphs of the first sentences of each paragraph, the reader can immediately identify how the author moves from one point onto the next point. The next characteristic within logical coherence, the theme of each following paragraph usually derives from the elaboration in the previous one. So the theme of the following paragraph usually derives from the elaboration in the previous one. The same tendency is observed in individual sentences within the paragraph. Again, the new element of at the end of one sentence quite often is picked up at the beginning of the next sentence. And therefore, the author builds a certain chain. So we start with the known point, proceed to the new information, and then this new information becomes known and in its turn gives rise to more information later. What else? The relations between sentences and the clauses within the sentences are usually made explicit through the use of connectives. I would even say that it is very important to use those connectives correctly, because again, they allow the readers to unequivocally identify the relations between the sentences. So also the texts are characterized by various kinds of cross-reference relations, and they can be anaphoric and cataphoric. When we talk about anaphoric relations, we point to the information which was mentioned earlier. When we talk about cataphoric relations, we point forward to what is to come. You probably have seen it in, for example, academic articles when the authors say that a certain point will be further elaborated in the next section or in 2 sections below. Or you can say sometimes, rather, you can say it as well if you want to. You can see that sometimes the authors point out that certain definitions were given, for example, in the previous chapter in the book. The same should be applicable to your own academic papers. If necessary, you should establish cross-references within different sections or between different sections of your own paper, or even within different sections if necessary. And these indicators should, of course, be explicit because they make it easier for the readers to read the text. Right. So that all these means altogether would establish the logical coherence of the text. The next point, which was objectivity. Again, there are certain specific linguistic means which ensure that the text can be described as objective. I would probably start with the use of accounts of experiments, if you provided any, because every experiment needs to be described in detail. And it is done on purpose because other researchers, from the description of the experiment, should be able to reproduce the experiment and receive similar results. If the experiment cannot be reproduced by another researcher, for example, within a different laboratory, that would cast doubts over the initial experiment. And that is very important. The same thing is applicable to all sorts of analysis. Again, the procedure should allow other researchers to reproduce the same analysis and probably with different material, but arrive at similar results. If it doesn't happen, then of course research can be doubted, there might be mistakes, and it will affect the trustworthiness of the publication and even sometimes the researcher. The second linguistic technique, I guess, to create the objective character of the text will be to resort to limited use of personal pronouns. You have heard that in academic papers, mostly third-person pronouns are allowed, and the researcher can or should not rather speak of oneself in the first-person singular. Usually, we should come across the first-person plural pronoun. I hope you remember it's the pronoun we. Okay, even though we can potentially imply only the researcher and the academic supervisor, as in your case, still it is appropriate to say we. Although I must say that in some papers, I have seen the first person singular pronoun I used. So far, I would say these were American papers, and only in the part where the author stated the most important point, basically the claim that the author made in the paper. And in this case, I guess it's the sort of feature which is typical of certain kinds of texts and allows the author to claim authorship of the idea. Sorry. What else? How else can we provide objectivity? Terminology. The next means of providing objectivity is terminology. Terms are important in academic discourse, in scientific discourse. You know that different sciences have their own terminology. The most important point about terminology is that terms are monosemantic. And also terms are usually restricted to certain areas of human knowledge. Although in the current trend towards interaction between different branches of science, terms can travel from one sphere of academic research to another, we say that terms are borrowed from one science to another science. Of course, there also are some terms which do not seem to have just one meaning. I would start with the notorious notion of style, if you remember. It doesn't have a single universally accepted definition. First of all, owing to the duration of research into style. And in this case, it doesn't always work perfectly as the rule book says. Anyway, in general, still terms are supposed to be given a specific definition. Sometimes when certain terms can have more than one definition or can differ in some details, it's important to check in which meaning these terms are used in a specific paper. So quite often in this case, the authors would actually inform the readers how exactly such a term is understood in a specific paper. So this is something you need to be careful with. Also, I would say terms can lose their scientific character. They can become determinalized, and in this case, they would enter general communication. One of the examples of such a term is the term laser. From the sphere of physics, it moved into even fiction. As you know, you have all sorts of laser weapons in all sorts of futuristic sci-fi publications, books, stories, drama, films, and so on and so forth. The next characteristic of academic discourse, as we said, was the impersonal statement of facts. Again, here we have quite a number of different means which ensure that the academic paper reflects the reality of life, right? It reflects the objective nature of the academic description. And first of all, of course, the construction which will come to your minds, hopefully, will be the use of passive constructions. So passive constructions allow, so to say, to remove the researcher from the academic research. So things are described as if they are happening by themselves without any kind of human interference, which can obviously imply that people affect the outcome of the experiments. Not that it usually happens, but even linguistically, we are supposed to remove such a possibility. But passive constructions are not the only means which allow the text to become more impersonal. We can also talk about the use of human subjects, but in most cases, they will be in plural. So it will be researchers, scientists, academicians, and so on and so forth. Not even in those cases when we don't have more than one person. Besides, we have another very nice means, very convenient means of making the text impersonal, and that is called the use of non-human grammatical subjects combined with active voice. So the use of non-human grammatical subjects combined with active voice. For example, you have seen such sentences as the experiment demonstrates, or even the results suggest. So the experiment demonstrates, or the results suggest. We clearly know that the result cannot possibly suggest anything, and the experiment does not demonstrate anything at all. It is the scientists, human beings, who interpret the text or interpret the test or interpret and process the results. But the language obviously means that these processes seemingly happen of their own volition without the academic involvement, as if the lab workers at that moment go somewhere to have a cup of coffee. I don't know. Whereas all the, I don't know, bacteria grow and animals multiply and, I don't know, sentences analyze themselves, for example. I don't know. But anyway, you can have all sorts of fun with academic research in this case. You don't have to be there. Okay. One more means of creating the impersonal statement of facts will be the use of various nominalized forms. The use of various nominalized forms. Also, those help to make sure that the human beings is, so to speak, removed from the process of academic research and the processes which are under study within the academic research. Right. Feature number 4, which we need to talk about, is called clarity. And here, first of all, we can say that some of the linguistic means can contribute to more than one characteristic of academic research, because clarity is also provided with the help of terminology. Simply because terms are monosemantic, the meaning is supposed to be shared by different researchers, and the use of terminology should not create any disagreement between the researchers. Not that it always works, as you know, but well, in the majority of cases, it does. Besides terminology, clarity is provided with the help of various non-verbal representations. So non-verbal representations. What can we have here? Here we talk about all sorts of illustrations. We can have graphs, we can have charts, we can have various schemes, which very unequivocally reflect certain processes or certain relations between different kinds of data. I'm pretty sure you will be using some of those in your own academic papers, especially when you are making your final presentation of the results of your research, because they all allow to very clearly, unequivocally, and compactly to present the data which you receive. Besides these non-verbal representations, we can also talk about the so-called alternative languages. The alternative languages is something you will find in chemistry, for example, or in mathematics, where specific special characters allow the researchers in the spheres to write down, for example, the descriptions of certain chemical processes, which of course will be much longer in words. The same thing goes about mathematics, where you have the formulas, which again allow the researchers to present certain relations, for example, between different kinds of measurements and units in a very compact format. These, as you know, these alternative languages can sometimes be borrowed from one science into another. For example, mathematical formulas can be found in physics, again for the same purpose, to present certain kinds of information in a very concise and compact, and I would say again unequivocal way. Right. The next characteristic number 5, is brevity. Brevity does not mean that the text has to be short. Brevity allows to fill the text with the largest possible amount of information in the reasonably restricted amount of linguistic means. Okay. How can we do that? Well, first of all, this is done with the help of different genres of scientific writing, having their typical forms of presentation. For example, if we talk about popular scientific texts, most of them will be following the compositional structure of an essay. So we will have introduction, we will have the body, and we will have the conclusion. And since we know what to expect, right, and where we can expect to find certain kind of information, we can actually specifically concentrate on only those parts of the text that we are interested in. The same thing can be said about, for example, academic articles. You know that first of all, academic articles contain the so-called abstract, which is supposed to give a very compact presentation of the central idea of the text, which of course would allow the readers to first of all go through the abstract and after that decide if they need to read the whole text or not. Of course, that saves time, right? That saves effort in processing information. And sometimes it might even be sufficient to use the information from the abstract alone for, I don't know, some maybe basic purposes. Although, of course, if you are carrying out serious academic research, it's a good idea to read the whole text. But again, since most structures follow, as you should know, a very specific pattern, we have the so-called IMRAD structure, which will be introduction, methods and materials, results and discussion. You know where to expect certain kinds of information. So, for example, if you are very well familiar with the existing research in a certain sphere, you will not be interested in reading the review of literature, which is at the beginning of the text. You would concentrate on the results and discussion, for example, or you even concentrate on the conclusion. Depends. If you're not very well familiar with specific kind of research, of course, then you will look, for example, at the review of literature at the beginning of the text, or you will look specifically for the description of the experiments or materials, maybe if you know everything else from this particular text. That, of course, allows first of all, of course, the writers to organize the text in a certain way, and secondly, the readers can look specifically at that part of the text which is most important for them. What else? What other means are to contribute to the brevity of the text? This will be abbreviations and acronyms. You know the difference between the abbreviation and acronyms. When we have an abbreviation, we enumerate the letters. When we have the acronym, it is an abbreviation which can be pronounced like a word. Sometimes certain abbreviations are created especially to sound like acronyms because they are easier to pronounce. And some abbreviations eventually become words. I think this was the case of the word laser, actually. It started its life as an acronym and then turned into a word of its own. Abbreviations can be generally known, like DNA, for example, or abbreviations can be created specifically within a certain sphere of research or within even a certain publication. For example, you can create certain abbreviations for your own paper, but of course you need to provide your readers with the explanation what your abbreviation stands for. If the abbreviation is generally known, sorry, then of course there is no need to decipher it. So RNA and DNA will be known to everybody. I guess we all know this COVID acronym now for this new virus, which is out there in the world and which is making me obviously talk to you long distance from this computer. And also, I guess, surprise, surprise, some academic texts can contain limited use of elliptical sentences. Not a high proportion, obviously, maybe not in all genres, but when it is possible to avoid or to omit certain words which can be easily restored from the context and which will not lead to any kind of misunderstanding, of course, such text will be characterized by the use of elliptical sentences. Right. Okay, I hope you're with me. And apparently you can go back to this lecture afterwards. And I was told that for some time it will exist online. Now, the sixth point was authority. And here, first of all, we will talk about quotations and references. Both quotation and references are an important integral part of academic writing, and obviously you are familiar with it, and even you remember the need to quote and reference your papers appropriately, because otherwise you may be accused of plagiarism, and you should not plagiarize other people's words or other people's ideas. So what is the difference? Quotations are words which are actually taken from a different text. Quotations are supposed to be precise, verbatim, word for word reproduction of another text. The quotations can be of different lengths. They can be given as full sentences, or they can be included as a part of your own sentence, but obviously they need to be marked off, I would say, rather, limited, or well, the bold section is supposed to be shown with the help of punctuation marks. And if you quote, you are supposed to provide a reference. In other words, reference is something that tells the readers of your text where this quotation came from. There are different formats of references. And again, you select whichever one you want for your own paper. But in this case, you need to remember you need to remember that all your references should be in the same format. Sometimes academic publications specify how these references need to be presented, what kind of information should be included into the references. And in this case, of course, you need to follow the instructions precisely. For example, this works for our university. We have our own publication of academic articles, and we have a very detailed instruction as to how to organize the text. Normally, when you quote, you are supposed to specify the page from which the reference, the quotation is taken. The two main systems of references in the text can be, first of all, by number, and then at the end of the text that you have the list of publications in a certain number, or you can give in brackets after the quotation. The brackets can be both square brackets or round, regular brackets. You can give the surname of the writer, the year of publication, and the page. If you do not quote, but you still take somebody else's ideas, you do not need to you do not need to use quotation marks, obviously, because you did not borrow somebody else's words, but you still need to make a reference to the paper from which you took the idea. The format can be the same. The only thing is, usually you do not specify the page numbers. You can make a reference to a whole article. You can make a reference to a whole textbook, for example, or monograph or dissertation if you want to, without specifying a certain section in it. And in this case, obviously, you do not need to provide the specific page because there isn't any anyway. But you need to include information about the publication in both cases into your bibliography. And again, you need to provide quite a lot of detailed information. So once again, when you borrow words from other academic papers, do remember to make notes as to where you took it from. It will be easier to add it to the to your own paper and make the proper reference. What else? Of course, with the current anti-plagiarism check systems, they pick up on a lot of things. So I would suggest you need to be rather careful and obviously not to violate copyright, right? Don't steal other people's ideas. It's not a good thing to do. Also, I have in the list of information, I have the point that authority also can be expressed with the help of footnotes, but I would say it's different these days, and I would rather include the use of footnotes into the section which deals with the logical and coherent character of the text. Now, why are footnotes mentioned together with quotations and references? Because in some older books, footnotes were actually used to include the references. So the footnotes are little pieces of text which are found, as the name suggests, at the bottom of the page. Also, you have probably come across the so-called end notes. For example, you have them at the end of the chapter, you can have them at the end of the article, or sometimes you have them all accumulated at the end of the book. What is typical of both footnotes and endnotes these days? Both of them contain information of secondary character. So when you describe, for example, some theory, and you want to make an additional commentary, you should not really violate the logical pattern that you are building in your paper. Remember, we spoke about it when the theme of the sentence in the beginning is followed by the reme, that is the new information, and the reme of the sentence becomes the theme of the subsequent sentence. And you have this chain of new and old information, which provides the reader with the opportunity to follow the logic of the writer. If you start inserting any kind of additional points within this chain, you may confuse the reader. And for that purpose, we have the footnotes, which can say that, for example, certain problem was also studied by other researchers, maybe in a related field, maybe in a different field. You don't really need to go into details about a particular research because it's not within your academic domain. But by including this kind of information into your papers, you demonstrate that you studied your field. You are familiar with what other people have done before you in this particular area of research. Okay? So in this case, obviously, endnotes and footnotes become important in their own right, but it's not so much authority as the logical coherence of the text, which they contribute to. Just checking time, how we're doing time-wise. Okay, right. So if we have no questions about the characteristic features of academic writing, now is the time to look at the linguistic characteristics, and we need to look at lexical means, grammatical characteristics, and some stylistic dimensions of the academic research. Okay, now we start with the lexical characteristics of scientific English. And first of all, we start with the general description of typical vocabulary. which we can find in academic writing. And the first group of words can be described as subject matter neutral vocabulary. Subject matter neutral vocabulary. Subject matter is hyphenated. Subject matter neutral vocabulary. What we can include here is, first of all, we can include here everyday words which are used to identify new discoveries and hypotheses. So we can find here everyday words which are used to identify new discoveries and hypotheses. For example, interestingly enough, in particle physics, физика частиц, right? In particle physics, some characteristics of certain particles can be described as strangeness, flavor, or color. So strangeness, flavor, or color. In Russian, I remember coming across such a term as очарованные кварки, which is a scientific term. It is not a stylistic device. Although I won't be able to tell you in detail what exactly happens to those specific particles and why they have such a strange name. But you can look it up yourselves. Right. So besides these everyday words, we can also come across a number of verbs. Verbs perform quite a number of functions, and again, they will be found in all kinds of academic writing, irrespective of the topic or the area of academic research. For example, we have here verbs of exposition. So verbs of exposition. For example, ascertain, A-S-C-E, right? Ascertain, that is make certain. Assume, determine, verify, and so on. So verbs of exposition: ascertain, determine, verify, assume, and so on. The second category of verbs here will be the verbs of warning and advising. Verbs of warning and advising. For example, avoid, check, ensure with an E, prevent, or notice. So avoid, check, ensure, prevent, or notice, for example. The third category of verbs here will be verbs of manipulation. Verbs of manipulation. Here we understand the verbs which describe the activities that researchers perform, for example, in the course of the experiment. What do we have here is, for example, adjust, align, A-L-I-G-N, align, connect, extract. You know, the extract is a noun, to extract is a verb, or prepare, for example, and so on. And then we have, for example, adverbial modifiers, adjectival modifiers and their corresponding adverbs or related adverbs. So adjectival modifiers and then their related adverbs. For example, gradual and gradually. So gradual and gradually. Subsequent and subsequently. Continuous and continuously. and, for example, clockwise and counterclockwise. For example, if you're telling people to stir something, you stir it clockwise or you stir it counterclockwise. Or you turn some, I don't know, image or something, for example. So that was the first group of lexical means, which can be seen in different kinds of academic writing. The second group, of course, will be technical terms reflecting the specialized subject matter of scientific domains. So technical terms reflecting the specialized subject matter of scientific domains. Here we have, for example, our terminology from stylistics. So the names of stylistic devices, for example, all of these will be terms. Okay. Group number 3 is the use of abbreviations or just abbreviations in general. We spoke about them already. I don't want to go into too details. Group number 4 will be novel vocabulary. Novel vocabulary. As you know, science is the birthplace for new words, both the creation of new words if necessary and the creation of new meanings for the existing words. Just to give an example of a novel word, the verb to reboot, double O, right, to reboot. Obviously, you're used to it now, but obviously somebody had to create it first to describe the process of restarting a computer by reloading the software into it. Oh, the word software itself is also, of course, a new word. What else can we say in general? These are not probably groups, but these are probably characteristics of lexical characteristics of academic writing. So first of all, we can say that scientific vocabulary is characterized by a large amount of Latin loanwords. Latin loanwords. As you know, most terminology comes from Latin or came from Latin, obviously sometimes from the Greek language as well. But the overwhelming majority is from Latin, or it came from Latin via French as well. Then, of course, we can talk about the general high lexical density in academic writing. High lexical density. Again, because texts are mostly written, or even if they're presented orally, still the speakers had an opportunity to think out everything they had to say. So they are quite precise in expressing themselves. They have enough time to come up with the best way of expressing the thoughts they have about certain topics. Then finally, in general, academic writing is characterized by absence of vulgarisms and slang. So absence of vulgarisms and slang. Also, of course, it doesn't mean that if two scientists disagree over some important academic matter, it doesn't mean that they will not allow themselves, for example, to use vulgarisms and slang if they particularly dislike each other. But of course, normally such words are edited out of academic publications. Right, so this is what I had to say about the lexical characteristic. Again, time check. I'm doing well. So, grammatical characteristics of scientific English. Grammatical characteristics of scientific English. And partially they will overlap with what we already said before. First of all, if we talk about the sentences, sentences in academic English are very often long with a complex internal structure. So they are long with a complex internal structure. We have a combination of both complex and compound sentences, so we talk about all patterns of composite sentences, as I hope you remember from your grammar classes. There are three types of sentences within the academic writing, and to an extent they reflect the logic of academic research. We have postulatory sentences, postulatory, P-O-S-T-U-L-A-T-O-R-Y, postulatory. The second one is argumentative. I don't think I should spell that, you should write it. Argumentative. And finally, we have formulative. Formulative. And they reflect basically, as I said, the logic of academic research, because you start by stating the hypothesis, provide support or argumentation for it, and at the end of this logical chain, you formulate the final hypothesis or the final statement or the theory, or you draw certain conclusions concerning the postulated hypothesis. What else? The complexity of scientific English is also provided by high frequency of noun phrases. So the complexity is provided by high frequency of noun phrases. Then again, something we mentioned before, the use of passive constructions. They're also a typical grammatical feature. Going back to the sentence structure, one point which I should have made probably earlier, we should mention that subordination normally prevails over coordination. Subordination normally prevails over coordination, which means that you should not just rely on the conjunctions and but to link sentences. You also need things like because, therefore, thus, however, although, if, when, and so on, right? So please don't forget about those. What else? We also have limited use of personal pronouns as markers of subjectivity. Limited use of personal pronouns as markers of subjectivity, but of course we have a lot of third-person pronouns because they also establish cohesion within the text. So that's important. We have the use of nominalized forms, different kinds of nominalized forms. And we can also point out the use of parentheses, which is there to, allowing the writer or the speaker to qualify the points that the person makes in the course of academic writing or academic speaking, I guess. So it works there. Right, so this is what concerns the means of grammar or grammatical characteristics of scientific English. So once again, very quickly, long and complex sentences, subordination prevailing over coordination, three types of sentences, postulatory, argumentative, formulative, which reflect the overall logic of the academic writing and academic presentation. Complexity provided by high frequency of noun phrases, abundant use of passive constructions, limited use of personal pronouns as markers of subjectivity, use of nominalized forms of all kinds, and the use of parentheses. So these are all typical grammatical means. Right. Finally, the third segment concerning the characteristics of English scientific discourse. This will be the stylistic dimension. So some stylistic characteristics still make their way, or I should probably say worm their way into academic writing or academic discourse. Not in abundance, but they can be found there. Sorry. First of all, we have the use of quotations. Quotations can be used for different purposes. Most of them can be employed as the means of supporting the author's point of view, and you know it. But sometimes quotations can be used as a starting point of some kind of discussion. And sometimes even writers can quote in order to disagree with this or that quotation and then try to present their own view on the topic. So we end up with some kind of academic discussion. That is also, of course, possible. Some genres can contain a certain amount of emotive evaluation. So some genres can contain a certain amount of emotive evaluation. Human beings, well, scientists are also human beings. They have certain emotions and they can be rather passionate about some of the points which they are researching or I don't know, looking into or agreeing with or disagreeing with. So we can find that. Emotiveness can be found in academic writing as well. Again, because people take certain points close to heart and then they can be quite passionate about certain descriptive presentations. Again, not in all texts. I don't think you can think of a dissertation or a thesis which will contain something like that. But I would say popular scientific writing can benefit from certain means of emotiveness. What else? We can talk about the use of the so-called contact words. Again, not in all genres, but we can think about popular scientific texts when the author addresses the reader, so tries to establish some kind of contact with the readers. And maybe in some oral presentations, again, it's a good idea to contact, to establish rather contact with the audience. Even, I guess, in my case, since you have the opportunity to comment in the chat, we do have some kind of contact. And even though I can't see you, I still hope you are there at the sort of receiving end of this internet feed. Right. Finally, two very important issues, two very important points that you probably would not expect to find in academic writing, but why not? On the other hand, why not? I mean, again, people are different, and since the main purpose is to, or the main aim is to communicate ideas, well, a lot of means can contribute to this communication. We can talk about, first of all, penetration of a dialogue or represented speech into academic discourse. So penetration of a dialogue or represented speech into academic discourse. I think I'm going to read to you an example, but I don't think I don't want to dictate it to you. I think it gives a very good illustration as to where we can find certain elements of dialogues or represented speech in academic writing, with, of course, all its limitations. The quotation is as follows: "The intelligent non-psychologist can perhaps be forgiven if, after reading this volume in the hope that new directions might lead to new destinations, he feels that he has been taken for a ride." So once again, the intelligent non-psychologist can perhaps be forgiven if, after reading this volume, in the hope that new directions might lead to new destinations, he feels that he has been taken for a ride. What we have here is really presentation of penetration of a dialogue, because the author tries to hypothesize a possible reaction of a reader of a certain book. And through this presentation of this potential commentary made by the reader, the author expresses the idea that the book is not very good, right? So the author criticizes the book, but the author doesn't do it directly. The author doesn't say in his own voice or in his own words that the book is bad. The author is creating a hypothetical reader who is described as the intelligent non-psychologist who would or who could be puzzled by the book and by the book failure to satisfy the thirst for knowledge. And of course, I hope that some of you noticed that when we talk about new directions leading to new destinations, again, we do not mean it literally when we talk about academic research. In this case, the author resorts to a conventional metaphor. Right, and that takes us to the last stylistic dimension of English academic or scientific discourse, and that is the use of figurative language. Most of these means will be conventional, obviously. We do not expect them to be extremely bright. They're not supposed to create an extremely vivid image because they would distract the reader's attention from the central points which the author wants to make. But still, we can come across some rather curious instances, and in some genres, even across genuine metaphors. For example, I think this quotation comes from a review of a thought of a book, and it contains an image, clearly. The quotation is as follows. Again, I don't expect you to write it down. I'm just reading it so you can get a feeling of what kind of interesting means we can find in academic writing, and not all academic writing is dry and unimaginative and boring and very difficult to understand. Although, of course, with academic writing, it's very easy because as soon as you don't understand a word, it's most probably a term. So it's very handy for analysis. Anyway, so the quotation goes as follows. The chief result of such general recommendations without any guidance about what can be recommended must surely be to produce severe indigestion. Right? So in this case, obviously, the negative reaction to a book is described as a bout of severe indigestion, when people have some problems and a very uncomfortable feeling in their stomachs. But as we said, scientists are people too. They are allowed to use imagery if necessary, as long as it is not distracting the reader's attention from the central points made by the writer. Right, and I guess the closing remarks for today's lecture will be to say a few words about popular scientific discourse, or popular science discourse, we can call it both ways, which is widely spread, right, which involves a lot of different readers or listeners, because you can also have lectures built on the principles of popular science discourse, and therefore we should not leave it without our attention. So popular scientific discourse follows the main principles of academic writing, but some of the characteristic features can be simplified or omitted altogether because of one primary difference between the scientific discourse proper and popular scientific discourse, and that is, as I guess you know, the target audience. So the difference between popular science and science proper is determined by the target audience. In the case of popular scientific discourse, the target audience is quite broad. It includes general public, right? But at the same time, of course, it means that these people are not experts in a certain field, or they may have actually very little knowledge about specific academic fields. And that means that the writer has to modify the presentation of the information in accordance with the typical characteristics and the requirements of the target audience, which in its turn means that all popular scientific discourse is reader focused or reader oriented. It means that on the one hand, the authors may need to omit certain details which might be too difficult to explain or to grasp. And quite often the authors might need to explain to the general public something that experts in this particular field would already know automatically. So the texts are supposed to be much more detailed and much more explanatory in their nature. On the other hand, the writers of popular scientific texts need to remember that the readers obviously are motivated to find out something about a specific sphere of human knowledge, but they may not be motivated to overcome difficulties in understanding such texts. So if for example, students or scientists read a scientific text proper, they have an internal motivation to find out what the text is about, and that allows us, or that makes us, I guess, persevere with reading. Obviously, in the case of students, quite often the motivation is provided by the academic supervisor, who's telling you you have to read these texts, otherwise you will not be able to understand the topic, and you will not be able to write your own paper. So to an extent, we sort of frighten you into reading academic texts. We can't do that to the readers of popular scientific texts. If they don't like it, if they don't understand it, they will not read it, and they will not have any consequences of this refusal to read. They will just not find out information about something. So consequently, the texts in popular science are supposed to be made interesting for the general public, and that is achieved by a large number of illustrations or all sorts of graphic means or detailed descriptions of certain phenomena, or, for example, experiments, and the omission of all the irrelevant information. You can also see that in many cases in popular scientific texts, we hardly ever see quotations and references. And of course, the readers are not expected to go and read more on this particular subject if they can't understand everything straight from the text. So popular scientific text normally would contain as much information as possible because the readers are not expected to do their own research on this particular topic. Obviously, it doesn't prevent them from doing this kind of research, but they don't have to do it. They don't have to continue researching. They can rely on the trustworthiness of the author of the popular scientific text and on the thoroughness of such authors, and they will not be expected to read anything else. Okay, and I guess the last minutes. Right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you two examples. The first comes from scientific text proper. The second one is a popular scientific text. So just to give you a feel of the difference between the two. So the first one comes from the academic journal called Nature. The text is follows, the extract is as follows. Malaria is a major cause of morbidity and mortality, claiming an estimated 1 million lives a year in Africa alone. Plasmodium falciparum, the most important agent of human malaria, has not been maintained for more than 2 for 6 in vitro. The development of a vaccine for malaria depends on suitable culture methods for the production of relevant agents. Okay, so that was the academic or scientific text. And now we have popular scientific text also connected to the same disease. This text comes from the Times. A breakthrough in research aimed at the development of vaccines against malaria has come at a time when international organizations, including the World Health Organization, are campaigning for the expansion of research into the control of parasitic diseases of the third world, such as malaria, leprosy, and so on. And of course, as you can see, the second text contains fewer terms and provides more, or provides information which is more relevant to the general public, that certain breakthrough has occurred in the research aimed at the development of vaccines against malaria, rather than focusing on the peculiarities of the agent which causes this particular medical condition. Okay, I think I'm stopping at this point. I provided you with all the detailed information, and I would appreciate people who listened to this presentation and hopefully who managed to make notes about our today's presentation to just drop me a single note from your email addresses to my mail confirming that you listened to this presentation, and let me know if you have any kind of questions. Next time we have a seminar, it will not be live, right? So please keep an eye on your emails, right? Thank you, and that will be all. Bye-bye.